Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is a contextualized reading in our Intro to Critical Theory course. We're on to gender theory this week, and we have been reading Judith Butler's famous essay, Imitation and Gender Insubordination. It's originally given as a lecture at a conference on homosexuality at Yale, and then was printed in a book called Inside Out: Lesbian Theories, Gay Theories, edited by Diana Fuss from 1991. So just to give us a little bit of date and context here, I feel like Judith Butler maybe doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. She is especially with relation to gender theory, but just in general, she's one of the most um, widely recognized American philosophers living today. And I know she has a more recent book out. I was just noticing the other day, listening to an interview with Dr. Butler on a book called Who's Afraid of Gender. So she continues to work on this, but really in terms of gender studies and the field of gender theory, if we want to call it that, she might resist it. Um, she's foundational and certainly a foundational thinker in my own development. So I'm happy to be talking about her work today. In context with our course so far, we read Foucault last week, and we'll see Foucault showing up a little bit here in his history of sexuality, which is a reference here. But when we look at the beginning, the opening, two quotations here from Monique Wittig and then Gilles Deleuze here, I want to point just because it ties into where we've been recently. I'm going to point to the Deleuze quote here. Beyond physical repetition and the psychical or metaphysical repetition, is there an ontological repetition? This ultimate repetition, this ultimate theater gathers everything in a certain way, and in another way, it destroys everything, and yet in another way, it selects from everything. And that is going to be from Deleuze's famous book, Difference in Repetition. And I might come back to that we haven't been reading Deleuze in this particular class, but when we think about some of the stuff that I talked about in the Foucault contextualized readings from last week, there might be some overlap. But definitely what's at stake here is the question of identity, and identity in the way that we now refer to it, this phenomenon of identity politics. And what I think Butler is doing here is resisting identity politics. And that's like something maybe to be taken into account right at the beginning of this contextualized reading, because we are living through a moment where uh, the don't say gay type of statements are coming out, especially from people like Ron DeSantis and the right wing. So there's been a kind of major backlash, I think, in many ways. I mean, against in terms of gender, like even heteronormative gender, like or the resistance, the a backlash against abortion, for example, with the Dobbs decision. So there's a whole lot that we're living in right now, but especially in response to LGBTQIA or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, um, intersex, and asexual identities. We are living in a hotly contested zone, kind of culture war zone. Although in theory, we used to refer to the 1980s as the culture wars. So there's a kind of recycling of some of the terminology here. And what I mean to say, and what I want to kind of emphasize here with Butler is because I think that Butler, as a famous theorist, inevitably gets used um, uh, to support or as someone to be criticized in this broader phenomenon of identity politics. But when we look at actually what she's saying, is she's advocating for forms of resistance to that very process itself. And so this essay is really about emphasizing her ambivalence about identifying as a lesbian or identify or what are the categories that we use, and then how are those categories implemented in daily politics as well. Now, she's not saying that she wants to resist all politics either, but she wants to call attention to this aspect of identity. And so, really quickly here, although she's not going to refer to a lot to Lacan, we might think about some of the earlier things that I said in psychoanalysis lectures, that when we are thinking about identity, first of all, identity is always going to imply a kind of split in personality. That if we're going to have a concept of identity, we have to have at least two things to compare ourselves to, right? Like I don't know, like Batman and Bruce Wayne, like the secret identity, we have to have the other identity. We have to have two twins to know to compare to each other to call them identical twins, right? There might be more fragmentations that come up with identity as well. But we're looking, especially from a psychoanalytic perspective, um, that separation of ego from id in Freudian terms, and Freud's going to come up in this essay later on. And then the superego. So that might be one way of looking at it, but in Lacan's terms, or following Lacan uses some of these terms and concepts in his mirror stage work, but also the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary are some of the terms that Lacan uses and updates things with Freud as well. And so there's a lot of psychoanalysis going on in the background here, and it's important to understand that when we're doing gender theory, for example, although the importation or the reception, I guess, of Freudian psychology in the 1950s was devastating to people who were pathologized as being homosexual during that particular time period. The Diagnostic Statistics Manual since the early 70s has not pathologized homosexuality, but there was, of course, the phenomenon of people being institutionalized, of the idea that if somebody turned out to be homosexual, it was the mother's fault. If it was a gay man, for example, that the mother like gave the child too much affection, all sorts of stuff that I don't want to confuse with Freud himself, who is much more complicated. And then that's not to say that there isn't a kind of heteronormative structure that underlies Freud's models, like the Oedipal complex, for example, right? So when we think about Foucault from last week, and we think about people like Deleuze and this phenomenon known as post-structuralism, there's critique of those maybe perhaps overly simplified stable structures like something like the Oedipal complex, but that doesn't mean that we just throw it completely out the window. Um, and I would say particularly within French feminist theory, for example, psychoanalysis remains really important. But behavioralism and behavioral psychology and the pill taking, like psychiatry, that has become so present in American culture today, oftentimes sort of pushes against psychoanalysis language as well. And so it's important to know that Butler takes psychoanalysis seriously and Freud seriously to a certain extent here as well. And so this is all going to come out and when we think about identity and identity categories. So let's just jump in here. She opens up to theorize as a lesbian. She says, as I can, and I'm using she. I know that Butler has more recently changed identification to they, but because of the gender terminology with lesbian here, I'm probably going to use she. And it's a more, recent moment. It's more recently, Butler has adopted the they them pronoun. Um, so if I move back and forth and I say she, that it's because of the context and the timing in which this essay is written. Um, as I first considered At first, I considered writing a different sort of essay, one with a philosophical tone, the quote, being of being homosexual. The prospect of being anything, even for pay, has always produced in me a certain anxiety. For to be gay, to be lesbian seems to be more than a simple injunction to become who or what I already am. And in no way does it settle the anxiety for me to say that this is part of what I am. To write or speak as a lesbian appears a paradoxical appearance for this I, one which feels neither true nor false, for it is a production usually in response to a request to come out or to write in the name of an identity which, once produced, sometimes functions as a politically efficacious phantasm. I'm not at ease with, quote, lesbian theories, gay theories, for as I've argued elsewhere, identity categories tend to be instruments of regulatory regimes. And what we are seeing in attempts to legislate against identity categories such as gay or lesbian, or to affirm them in a kind of rights-based context, if we're doing LGBTQIA activism, the all of that is speaking to a political realm where identity categories are deployed in some sort of way and serve a condensing kind of function. Um, that Butler is ambivalent about. So Butler says whether as the normalizing categories of oppressive structures or as the rallying points of for liberatory contestation of that very oppression. This is not to say that I will not appear at political occasions under the sign of lesbian, but that I would like to have it permanently unclear precisely what that signifies. So it's unclear how I can contribute to this book. And this is the book, of course. I mean, she's giving it as a lecture first, but she's with a book on lesbian and gay theory, right? So she's going to contest the notion of theory here, and that's I want us to be thinking about this, especially when we're thinking about an intro to critical theory here. What do we mean by that word theory, right? She says, so it's unclear how I can contribute to this book and appear under its title, for it announces a set of terms that I propose to contest. One risk I take is to be recolonized by the sign under which I write. And so it is that risk that I seek to thematize. I'm thematizing the risk that when I operate under this context, in these theoretical conditions, that I'm being somehow bound, colonized within the language and the labeling that I now must operate under, right? So she says, uh, to propose that the invocation of identity is always a risk does not imply that resistance to it is always or only symptomatic of a self-inflicted homophobia. She's saying, yeah, I might like my resistance to being called a lesbian doesn't mean that I'm uh, simply homophobic and it's just my own self-hatred that's coming back onto me, right? Indeed, a Foucaultian perspective might argue that the affirmation of homosexuality is itself an extension of homophobic discourse. And yet, discourse, he writes on the same page, can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. So we want to think about that, like although that quotation is from this history of sexuality, we want to think about that the stylistics of Foucault's thinking back with the reading from last week, which was on governmentality, from a little bit um, later lecture of Foucault's, but the Foucault's style is about talking about the channeling of powers and how disciplinary situations do channel that power, whether we're in a psychiatric hospital, a prison, um, or within the discourse on government as opposed to sovereignty that creates this long formation of governmentality that then disciplines our own socializing processes itself, right? So, discourse itself can be both an instrument and an effective power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. So Butler says, I'm skeptical about the I, how the I is determined as it operates under the title of the lesbian sign, and I'm no more comfortable with its homophobic determination than with those normative definitions offered by other members of the quote gay or lesbian community. I'm permanently troubled by identity categories, consider them to be invariable stumbling blocks, and consider them, even promote them, as sites of necessary trouble. In fact, if the category were to offer no trouble, it would cease to be interesting to me. It is precisely the pleasure produced by the instability of those categories which sustains the various category to begin, wait, sorry, which, um, it is precisely the pleasure produced by the instability of those categories which sustains the various erotic practices that make me a candidate for the category to begin with. To install myself within the terms of an identity category would be to turn against the sexuality that the category purports to describe. And this might be true for any identity category which seeks to control the very eroticism that it claims to describe, authorize, much less liberate. We might think back to Glenshon Coulthard now and his critique of the politics of recognition here, because on the one hand, liberal politics of recognition wants to um, deploy categories and then afford those categories something like rights. But if we're going to be talking about sexuality, which is so much broader than one particular category or one name, and sexuality is, of course, much broader than the notion of sexual orientation, for example, then uh, Butler is appropriately calling out that if we aren't questioning the way that those categories are being used to confine us, how can we use them to liberate us? And this is that ambiguity is operating in a context here with respect to lesbian, which is the particular term at use in use here. But we will get with Jack Halberstam in our next lecture more of an introduction to trans and transgender stuff. And so I'm very well aware that in the 21st century, there's been an explosion of trans gender issues and identity categories and a nuanced gendered terminology within that. But the reason in an intro course to go back to these texts from the 1990s is so that we have a sense of the way that this stuff is being theorized in really interesting and productive ways that then make way for the later explosion in trans discourse. Um, so Butler goes on, what's worse, I do not understand the notion of theory. And I'm hardly interested in being cast as its defender, much less in being signified as part of an elite gay/lesbian theory crowd that seeks to establish the legitimacy and domestication of gay/lesbian studies within the academy. Is there a pre-given distinction between theory, politics, culture, and media? How do those divisions operate to quell a certain intertextual writing that might well generate wholly different epistemic maps? Remember, like how I was talking last week about writing degree zero, right? And how French theory embraces literariness and psychoanalysis. And in doing so, it does not read like traditional philosophy. And then it irritates the hell out of traditional philosophers, right? Because then it gets labeled like postmodern and all sorts of stuff. No, no, there's no truth anymore, all sorts of stuff because people aren't able to sort of read in an interdisciplinary way or to read in a sophisticated enough way to look at the ways that language performs something deeper, right? In linguistic terms, to go back to Ferdinand de Saussure, that the performance of an individual's language or idiolect, to use Roland Barthes' term, is yet one particular instance of performance in speech of a broader category of langue in French, or language more broadly speaking, right? And so or to go back to the famous quotation from Martin Heidegger, language speaks us, right? Especially if you're monolingual and you grow up speaking one language. It's not like you invented that language, right? We're inheriting our language through social forms, and that becomes perhaps limiting to our expressibility, our expressivity, right? Or if we're able to speak fluently across multiple languages, then we have more expressive fluidity. And we can perhaps see what one language does really well, but maybe another language doesn't quite do as well. Um, and so I think that Butler is very much continuing in the, I mean, she's just cited Foucault earlier, but definitely continuing in that tradition of thinking about what are the potential qualities of an aesthetics of writing and production um, that that resists a kind of a terminological fixation, right? She would drive somebody like Thomas Hobbes crazy. In the next paragraph, if the political task is to show how that theory is never merely theoria, never merely just a way of looking in that kind of Greek sense of the term of vision or God's vision, like the theo in theory, right? If the political task is to show that theory is never merely theoria in the sense of disengaged contemplation, and to insist that it is fully political, phronesis, which is, of course, Aristotle's term, right? Like for practical action or praxis, she says, then why not simply call this operation politics or some necessary permutation of it? What is the relation between theory and politics? I've begun with confessions of trepidation and a series of disclaimers, but perhaps it will become clear that disclaiming, which is no simple activity, will be what I have to offer as a form of affirmative resistance to certain regulatory operations of homophobia. Butler then goes into the metaphor of the closet and this kind of in and out of the closet language, which I might feel a little bit old to some of my students today, because we live in a time period, thankfully, if you ask me, where elementary school students are encouraged to express ways that they might want to be identified in terms of gender qualities, or to change things. So there is a much more public openness, but there's also a big public anxiety about, am I using the right pronouns? Oh, there they them, like so that there become these kinds of policing qualities that get employed as well. And I see it with my students in university all the time. If somebody's grown up, in a really small town and not been exposed to more gender inclusive language, sometimes other students can really come down hard on them. I think that, like, all of this discourse invites us to maybe um, uh, try to find ways to both be precise and critical in our language and in our critical theory, but that doesn't mean that we have to be assholes to each other. So yeah, sometimes all of us need to learn things and can't be uh, um, as one of my lesbian friends says, who I saw last night. Nothing heals in a place of blame and shame. uh, Butler goes on to talk about those categories of inside and outside as producing a kind of metaphorical frame, to use George Lakoff's terminology, right? That we have in the metaphorical ways that we use language, the frame itself is going to give us some delimiting of the categories and the channels of thought that we use to express ourselves. And so we might want to think about the metaphorical language to begin with. Butler says, can sexuality even remain sexuality once it submits to a criterion of transparency and disclosure, or does it perhaps cease to be sexuality precisely when the semblance of explicitness is achieved? Is sexuality of any kind even possible without that opacity designated by the unconscious, which means simply that the conscious, quote, I, who would reveal its sexuality is perhaps the last one to know the meaning of what it says. So, what produces the psychic excess from which the first person or subjective I emerges, right? If I'm putting it into just kind of linguistic terms, we use this neutral category of first person I in the English language. Every time I use that I, it is one form of a condensation of the psychic entity that's inside this brain or soul or however you want to put it. And at the same time, the I that I'm using right now in 2024 in the spring when I'm making this lecture is not the I of Roger from 2 years ago, is not the I, certainly not the I from Roger at 15 years old, right? So it's almost like a place marker when we use the I for whatever cumulative experience that I had at that particular moment in time. And so in the sense that when we maneuver into speech or into expression, we're condensing something that's much more broad and ambiguous in terms of the unconscious. And that is where sexuality is going to be, as opposed to the particularized performance in this one particular instance. Um, Butler says to claim this about the I and the unconscious is to claim that this is what I am, is to suggest a provisional totalization of this I. That's why I said the condensation of the I. But if the I can do so determine itself, then that which it excludes in order to make that determination remains constitutive of the determination itself. In other words, such a statement presupposes that the I exceeds its own determination, even when it produces that very excess in and uh, uh, by which, sorry, in and by the act which seeks to exhaust the semantic field of that I. In the act which would disclose the true and full content of that I, a certain radical concealment is thereby produced. This is very much sounding like Heideggerian language around truth, truth as being revelation or truth being a kind of covering, that when we use a term, we have a focus on the term, but there's a kind of cutting out of a extra linguistic type of context as well. And so we get down to a little bit of some philosophizing about the to be, that the copula or the to be verb, right, is, am, are, was, were, um, be, been, the in the English language. This is a verb the copula is the verb that says something about existence and something coming into existence, but it often operates in the English language in terms of an axial point between the subject and the object. So in a sentence like I am Roger, right? If I'm introducing myself, it's kind of weird because like is Roger there's the signifier Roger, and then there's a signifier of I. Are they the same thing? Well, there's something about the syntax of putting ourselves into language and the temporality of syntax that creates a particular order, subject, verb, object, which is the most common way that English as a language works. And our language wasn't always this way. It was in Old English or Anglo-Saxon, for example, it's inflected language. But after the French invasion, which where we have another romantic inflected language, one of the ways that modern English develops is we develop a rigid syntactic structure that then gets rid of inflection. For the most part, we can still hear it. You can still know that if I use thee, thou, thy, sounds like Shakespearean language, right? Um, uh, we don't say we can hear that it's wrong to say like, I am going to give this Jacques Rousseau book to thy. Thy is possessive pronoun, right? Um, so it is the genitive case in terms of linguistics, right? We don't say, I'm going to give this Jean-Jacques Rousseau book to thou either, right? It's to thee. The thee is the dative case of giving and taking away. The subject case is the nominative case. The objective case is the accusative case. We don't learn a lot of that stuff unless you're learning another language because English, we don't normally need to learn external grammar in order to learn how our own language works. And also because our language has a fixed syntactical structure. So if I mix up the words, I am Roger, I put the object first, like Roger, I am. I sound like Yoda from Star Wars or something. And then, but if I put the verb first, am I Roger, then the mixing up of the syntactic structure is actually what accomplishes making an interrogative or a questioning statement as opposed to a declarative statement like I am Roger, right? um, wonderful how language works, right? Indeed, Butler says the locus of opacity has simply shifted. Before, you did not know whether I am, but now you do not know what that means, which is to say that the copula is empty, that it cannot be substituted for with a set of descriptions, and perhaps that is a situation to be valued. Um, uh, uh, and that's with respect to the closet metaphor here. She says, "What, if anything, can lesbians be said to share? And who will decide this question? And in the name of whom? If I claim to be a lesbian, I come out only to produce a new and different closet. The you to whom I come out has now access to a different region of opacity." So Butler continues on with the closet metaphor, says, curiously, it's the figure of the closet that produces this expectation and which guarantees its dissatisfaction. For being out always depends to some extent on being in. It gains its meaning only within that polarity. Hence, being out must produce the closet again and again in order to maintain itself as out. This is what's echoing the famous work of Gilles Deleuze, difference and repetition. Sometimes if we're just repeating the same thing over and over again, um, uh, it it might show that in the necessity to keep repeating something, like in the way that like Ron DeSantis or right-wing politicians will intentionally use the word woke as something that they dislike in their political speeches over and over and over again to reinforce a kind of attitude. And there is something that is kind of brainwashy as a way to think about that. But also, I think what Butler is trying to say is that, like, when we kind of look at the necessity to kind of overemphasize any type of a category, when we start really looking at it, it itself kind of comes apart. We see that there's no center. This is the process of what Jacques Derrida will call in a future in some readings that we haven't done yet in class, he will call the process of deconstruction, right? And so this is all part of the kind of post-structural moment. Although, as I told my face-to-face students the other day in class, in European uh, theory and European thought, there isn't so much of a distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism. It's all just kind of structuralism. But that term post-structuralism emerges out of a Johns Hopkins conference in the late '60s, where a bunch of these major French thinkers were around. For me right now, in terms of Butler, all I'm trying to suggest is that Butler is very much acting within the lineage of French theory, even though she is this essay is talking about gender theory, and which is just something that we haven't been focusing on so much this particular semester so far. But now can hopefully see how gender theory is fitting into the broader discourse of critical theory as we've been inquiring into it. Later on in that paragraph, Butler says, um, in this sense, outness can only produce a new opacity, and the closet, that metaphor, produces the promise of a disclosure that can, by definition, never come. Is this infinite postponement of the disclosure of, quote, gayness produced by the very act of coming out to be lamented, or is this very deferral of the signified to be valued as a site for the production of values, precisely because the term now takes on a life that can never be permanently controlled. So this is very much a linguistic focus here, right? It is possible to argue that whereas no transparent or full revelation is afforded by the term lesbian and gay, there remains a political imperative to use these necessary errors or category mistakes, as it were, to rally and represent an oppressed political constituency. She says clearly, she's making a qualifier here. Clearly, I'm not legislating against the use of the term gay or lesbian, right? I'm not saying don't say gay, right? In the way that Ron DeSantis or somebody like that is saying that. My question is simply, which use will be legislated and what play will there be between legislation and the use such that the instrumental uses of, quote, identity do not become regulatory imperatives? If it is already true that lesbians and gay men have been traditionally designated as impossible identities, errors of classification, unnatural disasters within the juridical medical discourses, or what perhaps amounts to the same, the very paradigm of what calls to be classified, regulated, and controlled, then perhaps these sites of disruption, error, and confusion and trouble can be the very rallying points for certain resistance to classification and to identity as such. Again, a lot of influence from French theory here. Remember how I was talking about the French theorists were really interested in the history of insanity, not just Foucault, but people being interested in Marquis de Sade and Antonin Artaud, for example, the incurable, um, the thing that exceeds the normative in some sort of way. And later work by Deleuze and Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus, like capitalism and schizophrenia, that claim that like capitalism produces these regimes of language that, in their ever more attempts to um, uh, create in this marketized way, like this identity and this identity and this identity, what we get from that over time is just a kind of endless amount of fracture of identity, which is what constitutes schizophrenia to begin with, right? So this is part of their anti-Oedipus project, right? If the Oedipus project under Freud was to produce a set of models for how a individual subject should be formed, the developmental stages of psychology. The anti-Oedipal project is going to look at the psychic excess beyond that kind of stuff, right? To look at the Oedipal project as a regulatory regime, to use the kind of language that Foucault and Butler are using here as well. So next paragraph down here, Butler's saying, I'm not saying that we should not use these terms, but we need to be critical of how they're being used. So the question is not one of avowing or disavowing the category of lesbian or gay, but rather why it is that the category becomes this site of, quote, ethical choice. Is it not possible, later on in the paragraph here, is it not possible to maintain and pursue heterosexual identification and aims within homosexual practice and homosexual identifications and aims within heterosexual practices? If a sexuality is to be disclosed, what will be taken as the true determinant of its meaning? The fantasy structure, the act, the orifice, the gender, the anatomy? Um, uh, you have a homosexual encounter with one person one time, does that constitute that you are homosexual for the end of time? Is a man who's like engaging in homosexual sex or perhaps unfortunately like rape in a prison type of situation, does that action make them into um uh a homosexual? Within the gay men's community, there is discourse, of course, about like whether or not one is topping or bottoming, and like what constitutes true gayness. So that's something that these are just discussions that are had in different communities. Um, is it the act? Is the orifice? Is it the anatomy? What about intersex people, right? Is it the fantasy? You know, if I um, if I have a fantasy about something, but I never realize it, does that maintain a kind of stability for my cisgenderedness, right? Like the cisgender idea that I'm assigned a sexual or a sex category at birth, and that you know is in line with a socially produced gender category that, as Butler's going to say later on in this essay, seems to like follow from that sex category, and then that from that I am in this kind of sexual orientation trajectory that is geared towards hetero or the opposite sex. So that's the heteronormativity. This is what people generally mean in gender discourse by cisgender. Oh, so that's more recent, of course, than what the language that Butler's using here. Um, um, it is actually Butler who's going to question that kind of like quasi-linear trajectory, the idea that I'm assigned a sex at birth, that sex determines my social engagement with this thing called gender, and that out of that is going to be my sexual orientation. Somehow it's going to emerge in puberty or something like that. Um, Next section. Well, actually, just in that last paragraph before, Butler says the negative construct, in other words, the negative constructions of lesbianism as a fake or bad copy can be occupied and reworked to call into question the claims of heterosexual priority. Heterosexual priority says like this is this quasi-natural way for things to be done, and therefore people who deviate from that. That's why I use the word cisgender instead of straight, right? Because the metaphorical implication of straight means that if you are not if you're not that, then you are somehow crooked, that you are somehow off, right? And that's why we use the term cisgender in current discourse. Also, Butler is going to question just the very claims that heterosexuality has priority to begin with. Um, and so Butler says, in a sense, I hope to make clear in what follows. This is like the thesis statement of the essay, right? In a sense, I hope to make clear in what follows, lesbian sexuality can be understood to redeploy its, quote, derivativeness in the sense of displacing hegemonic heterosexual norms. Understood in this way, the political problem is not to establish the specificity of lesbian sexuality over and against its derivativeness, but to turn homophobic construction of the bad copy against the framework that privileges heterosexuality as origin, and so, quote, derive the former from the latter. This description requires a reconsideration of imitation, drag, and other forms of sexual crossing that affirm the internal complexity of lesbian sexuality constituted in part within the very matrix of power that it is compelled both to reiterate and to oppose. So a really nice thesis statement for interns. I think this is a really well-written essay. So that's going to be set up the method for the examples that Butler uses. And because we're kind of glossing this essay, and I obviously I really like this essay, and so I keep wanting to read more and more of it as we track, but I will have to move faster. The question of drag on the being of gayness and this necessary drag comes up, and we're getting a little bit of auto biography here. The professionalization of gayness requires a certain performance and production of a quote self, which is the constituted effect of a discourse that nevertheless claims to represent that self as a prior truth. When I spoke at the conference on homosexuality in 1989, when she was first delivering an earlier version of this, I found myself telling my friends beforehand that I was off to Yale to be a lesbian, which of course didn't mean that I wasn't one before, but that somehow then, as I spoke in that context, I was one in some more thorough and totalizing way, at least for the time being. So I am one, and my qualifications are even fairly unambiguous. Since I was 16, being a lesbian is what I have been. So, what's the anxiety, the discomfort? Well, it has something to do with that redoubling, the way that I can say, I'm going to Yale to be a lesbian. A lesbian is what I've been for so long. How is it that I can both be one and yet endeavor to be one at the same time? When and where does my being a lesbian come into play? And when and where does this playing as a lesbian constitute something like what I am? To say that I play at being a one is not to say that I'm not really one. Rather, where I play at being one is the way in which that being gets established, instituted, circulated, and confirmed. This is not a performance from which I can take radical distance. For this is deep-seated play, psychically entrenched play, and this I does not play its lesbianism as a role. Rather, it is through the repeated play of this sexuality that the I is insistently reconstituted as a lesbian I. Paradoxically, it's precisely this repetition of the play that establishes as well the instability of the very category that it constitutes. We might think about like some sort of homophobic expressions, right? And unfortunately, this can happen in people's relationships where uh, a young man, for example, is unwilling to acknowledge that he is sexually attracted to other men, and so what happens is it gets inverted into statements of that are homophobic or that are hatred of gay people, and it becomes so um, exaggerated, so hyperbolic that what it's really masking is the insecurity of sexual orientation that's going on within that particular subject, or within broader gay men's culture. The figure of like the cowboy, for example, or like the hyperbolic expression of conventional significations of masculinity, right? Or when you're on dating apps and you see a cisgendered woman, I want a real man. I want like cow boy, real man sort of thing. But then if you go to like a gay club like Charlie's here in Denver, where it's like a gay country western club, we get a different sort of notion of that that acknowledges um, the performativity of gender itself, that even celebrates gender as performativity, which is definitely a big part of not just gay men's culture, but of queer culture in general, is and queer theory, which is what Butler's essay here would sort of fall under, is the resistance to the politics of recognition. Um, to use Glenn Sean Coulthard's term from earlier in the semester, right? So Butler maneuvers on. I'm gonna kind of skip because I know this is going on. Butler says that the question I want to raise is this: ought such threats of obliteration dictate the terms of political resistance to them? And if they do such homophobic efforts to that extent win the battle from the start? There's no question that gays and lesbians are threatened by violence of public erasure. But the decision to counter that violence must be careful not to reinstall another in its place. Which version of lesbian or gay ought to be rendered visible, and which internal exclusions will be rendering visible institute? Can the invisibility of identity suffice as a political strategy, or can it only be the starting point for strategic intervention which calls for a transformation of policy? Is not a sign of is it not a sign of despair over public politics when identity becomes its own policy, bringing with it those who would police it from various sides? And this is what I wanted to like sort of talk about, because I definitely have seen this with students in the university where, I'm teaching a general studies class, and I might have a student who like last semester took a gender and women's studies class and has all of this really great language about cisgender and different transgender terms, and knows the difference between sex and sexuality. And then a student who has not taken any of those classes, who this is very new for them, um, uh, uh, says something, um, conflates sexuality and sex, for example, and then the other student gets on them, or like yells at them, or um, uh, uh, has to correct them, and they affect this air of superiority, right? There's like that policing type of thing that happens. That is not that doesn't do us a lot of good. In fact, it's a reinforcement of a different kind of regime. And so this sometimes comes up in current liberal discourse, where uh, people who are on the so-called left, I don't know that it necessarily has to be the left, right? So that left-right metaphor, how well does that work if we're talking about sex and sexuality? It's not like there aren't like gay people who are Republicans or something like that, right? But the idea that the term, which I don't like, and so I don't use it very much, like the term the woke left. Um, uh, uh, it's used both by like right-wing folks like Ron DeSantis, but it's also used by like mainline liberals to um, uh, uh, sort of express their despair for the police of language culture and the police of identity culture that's been emergent in universities, which are trying to be more inclusive on the one hand in terms of classic social justice, but out of the um, frustrations, especially for people of different, races or ethnicities or genders, for example, that have not been traditionally accepted as mainstream, and the frustration of being like, no, like we're here and we want to be recognized, and there has to be a kind of visibility to it. So that plays into the politics of recognition. And from that, there's this like, you don't get to keep ignoring like what informs our my particular group's uh, um, uh, social formation, whether that be race, gender, ethnicity, ability, disability. citizenship status, all of the categories that fall under the codes of so-called liberal inclusive excellence, right? Where we're trying in public institutions to be more inclusive, but then what unfortunately happens is through the redeployment of identity politics and identity policing, what emerges is not like the classic, like, let's have a more inclusive society. Instead, there becomes a kind of um, uh, brittle discourse of things must be this way, you must speak this particular way. And that gets read as a kind of fascism by mainline liberals. So the fascist left, which is a kind of mixture of terms. And in my own discourse, I call this the political theological vortex, which when we're in a society of shifting values, what happens is like the traditional feelings of people on the left might um, uh, uh, be being expressed by people on the right. So, you take January 6th, for example, like protest is good, right? Maybe even insurrection might be good, except when the wrong people all of a sudden do the insurrection, and it's the people on the right who are doing the big public protest, or when the people on the right are all coming out like to with all of their guns like loaded, ready to stand in front of the Capitol, and then the people who were like really big advocates for the women's march a few years ago, which I will admit I went to the women's marches, and I felt at the first women's march, I thought that some sanity still existed in my culture after Trump was elected. And so I really, really, I felt like, oh, this is like the best I've felt in months, just my own politics there. But if like stand up and protest and all of that sort of stuff only works for your particular political persuasion, then when it erupts on the other side, then what happens, right? Uh, so all of a sudden you have like the Biden administration calling for law and order police tactics, right? That we might associate with Richard Nixon or something earlier on. So that's what I mean by the political theological vortex, where the dialectic kind of shifts in different ways. And I'm speaking that in political categories, but we could do the same thing with gender categories here, or with racial categories as well. And that's just the moment that we are in right now. But I've definitely seen students be really mean to other students, and I think that the one thing that we could do is we could cultivate not an uncritical approach, or like that just ignores or passes over when people don't speak articulately. But there must be a kind of ethical comport that I think that Butler is suggesting with this particular essay, to account for ambiguity that doesn't turn into its own form of policing. Um, Next paragraph here. The identity sign I use now has its purposes seems right. Like I've got to use it, the term lesbian sometimes. But there is no way to predict or control the political uses to which that sign will be put in the future. And perhaps this is a kind of openness, regardless of its risks, that ought to be safeguarded for political reasons. If the rendering visible of lesbian/gay identity now presupposes a set of exclusions, then perhaps part of what is necessary or necessarily excluded is the future uses of the sign. There is a political necessity to use some sign now, and we do, um, but how to use it in such a way that its future significations are not foreclosed. How to use the sign and avow its temporal contingency at once. In avowing the sign's strategic provisionality rather than its strategic essentialism, that identity can become a site of contest and revision, indeed, take on a future set of significations that those of us who use it now may not be able to foresee. Now, Butler doesn't use the term trans in this particular essay, but I think that if we really approach more contemporary gendered language, there's a sense of transgender and where trans can mean something like transitioning from one gender to another gender. But there's another way that we might use the category of trans as being like kind of above, or maybe a little bit more in the ways that somebody might like identify as being non-binary, right? Which is a kind of a affirmation of queerness, a resistance to being located in any particular sexuality or sexual orientation or gender. Um, to begin with, and that becomes a kind of I think that language, although Butler doesn't use it at this point in Butler's life, like I think that that's something that 21st century gender discourse gives us, and especially in terms of critical theory, as a way of thinking about that. And of course, that isn't to say that there aren't people who someone who says I'm a trans woman or I'm a trans man, and I affirm that I want to be treated as a he him or a she her, right? Because that, on the one hand we could say that's my identity, but of course like anybody who is living it knows that it has more to do than with a kind of surface exposure to the pronouns that somebody else uses to call you what you are. Like that doesn't get at the deep psychic excess of what it means to be um uh who we are as humans, and as sexual beings. Uh, we get some discussion of Robert Mapplethorpe and homoeroticism here. I'm kind of glossing over that. There's a nice short paragraph here. It Butler says it's one thing to be erased from discourse and yet another to be present within discourse as an abiding falsehood. Hence, there is a political imperative to render lesbianism visible, but how is that to be done outside or through existing regulatory regimes? Can the exclusion from ontology itself become a rallying point for resistance, right? If heteronormative culture says that lesbianism is some sort of deviance or that it's somehow unnatural, or that it's a bad copy of um, a primordial sexuality that ought to be heterosexual in nature, right? Um, Butler's asking this rhetorically, can the exclusion from ontology itself become a rallying point for resistance? Butler says, as a young person, I suffered for a long time, and I suspect many people have, from being told explicitly or implicitly that what I am is a copy, an imitation, a derivative, example, a shadow of the real. Compulsory heterosexuality sets itself up as the original, the true, the authentic, the norm that determines the real, that determines the real implies that uh, being lesbian is always a kind of miming, a vain effort to participate in the phantasmatic plenitude of naturalized heterosexuality, which will always and only fail. And yet, I remember quite distinctly when I first read Esther Newton's Mother Camp, Female Impersonators in America, that drag is not an imitation or a copy of some prior and true gender. And according to Newton, drag enacts the very structure of impersonation by which any gender is assumed. Drag is not the putting on of a gender that belongs properly to some other group, for example, an act of expropriation or appropriation that assumes that gender is rightfully property of sex, that masculine belongs to male and feminine belongs to female. There's no proper gender, a gender proper to one sex rather than another, which is in some sense that affects his cultural property. Where the notion of proper operates, it is always and only improperly installed as the effect of a compulsory system. Drag, therefore, constitutes the mundane way in which genders are appropriated, theatricalized, worn, and done. It implies that all gendering is a kind of impersonation and approximation. If this is true, it seems there is no original or primary gender that drag imitates, but gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. In fact, it is a kind of imitation that produces the very notion of the original as an effect and consequence of the imitation itself. In other words, the naturalistic effects of heterosexualized genders are produced through the imitative strategies, which what they imitate is a phantasmatic ideal of heterosexual identity, one that is produced by the imitation as its effect. In this sense, the quote, reality of heterosexual identities is performatively constituted through an imitation that sets itself up as the origin and the ground of all imitations. And we can definitely go back to Foucault and the history of sexuality, where Foucault we start thinking about like, like when do people start first using the words like homosexuality and heterosexuality for ways that are usually to in some way um, indicate or legislate against some sort of behavior that has now become in the history of deviance or normativity of conduct has now become criminalized or delegitimized, right? Um, Next paragraph, Butler says, reconsider then the homophobic charge that queens and butches and femmes are imitations of a heterosexual real. Here, imitation carries the meaning of derivative or secondary, a bad copy of an origin which is itself the ground of all copies, but which is itself a copy of nothing. Logically, this notion of the origin is suspect, for how can something operate as an origin if there are no secondary consequences which retrospectively confirm the originality of the origin? The origin requires its derivations in order to affirm itself as an origin, for origins only make sense to the extent that they are differentiated from that which they produce as derivatives. Hence, if it were not for the notion of the homosexual as a copy, there would be no construct of heterosexuality as origin. Heterosexuality here then presupposes homosexuality. Next paragraph, in other words, the entire framework of the copy and the origin proves radically unstable. This is very much sounding like Jacques Derrida's deconstruction thought, right? Proves radically unstable as each position inverts into the other and confounds the possibility of any stable way to locate the temporal or logical priority of either term. Later on, imitation does not copy that which is prior, but produces and inverts the very term of priority and derivativeness. Next paragraph down in the middle, that heterosexuality is always in the act of elaborating itself is evidence that it is perpetually at risk. That is, that it knows its own possibility or becoming undone. Hence, its compulsion to repeat, which is at once for a foreclosure of that which threatens its coherence. And I will just say that is such a nice way of articulating this phenomenon that oftentimes gets latched onto, I will say, white male masculinity. And I'm going to speak from my own uh, social formation and my own experience here. That this phenomenon that sometimes people will call mansplaining, that white men like to hear themselves talk, or they get louder than other people, or they occupy a whole lot of conversational space. And there's something cartoonish and even buffoonish about the ways that this masculinity presents itself, interjects itself, talks over other people on a regular basis. And it is not necessarily a function of necessarily being a man or having a penis or being attracted in some certain way. It is an expression of a kind of social power that comes with those significations. And then the power to enact the privileges that are attributed to it, that makes it seem to some men that this is actually um, uh, somehow acceptable behavior. But in the over talking and the over mansplaining, what is actually being signified here, as Butler says, is the lack of power, the lack of control, and the anxiety on some perhaps unconscious level, um, that you're not all that, perhaps, right? And so I think that this is something that I will just for the moment here let, adopt the category for the the provisional category of cisgendered man. But I do think that this is something that a kind of masculine privilege of masculinity that must be reflected on in a thoughtful way for men who have grown up with not only the privileges of masculinity, but also if it's intersected, to use Kimberly Crenshaw's term. If it's intersected with a racialized sort of privilege, then I think it's something that definitely needs to be thought of. But instead, what I see often happening, even in critical theoretical discourse right now, is uh, a big pushback against so-called postmodern philosophy, like Judith Butler, right here, and then these kind of over assertive claims. I am a man and I am proud. I am a heterosexual man and I am proud. I will not be criminalized for being like uh, a heterosexual man. And I think that that kind of expression is really exhausting and ridiculous. And it comes from me to me. To me, this seems like an expression of uh, of 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 not only uncritical thinking, but just like uh, of deep insecurity, um, to say the least. But that's where repetition sort of comes from, like that through repetition, repetition, and repetition, that we don't get a real difference. To go back to Liz's terms here, Butler talks about repetition in another paragraph down below, where like the construction of a priority or an original sexual orientation, for example, only belies the instability of that construct. So Butler says, with respect to repetition, it's towards the end of um, the paragraph that starts as to claim that there's no performer. At the end of that paragraph, Butler's asking these questions again. If there is if repetition is the way in which power works to construct the illusion of a seamless heterosexual identity, if heterosexuality is compelled to repeat itself in order to establish the illusion of its own uniformity and identity, then this is an identity permanently at risk. For what if it fails to repeat, or if the very exercise of repetition is redeployed for the very different performative purpose? If there is, as it were, always a compulsion to repeat, repetition never fully accomplishes identity. That there is a need for a repetition at all is a sign that identity is not self-identical. It requires to be instituted again and again, which is to say that it runs the risk of becoming de-instituted at every interval. And in a hyperbolic, over-exaggerated form, it becomes a kind of repetition compulsion, right? Which is like a different kind of pathologized form of being. This is going to take us over into the last section of Butler's essay, Psychic Mimesis, where Butler's going to return to psychoanalysis and to Freud and to the idea of melancholia in Freud. Um, so the beginning of the psychic mimesis section, what stylizes or forms an erotic style and or gender presentation, and that which makes such categories inherently unstable is a set of psychic identifications that are not simple to describe. Some psychoanalytic theories tend to construe identification and desire as two mutually exclusive relations to love objects that have been lost through prohibition and or separation. Think of the Oedipal complex there, right? Like I have lost that state of oneness that I was inside my mother's womb. I've come out into the world. I'm in competition with the father figure who I don't have language yet as a young child or a toddler. And so mom's attention is being given to the father in this heteronormative Viennese family structure that Freud uses right? And through the frustrations of the father, I develop the father is the sense of the no. And from that, I get the rules of society, the super ego that comes to give a kind of governmentality over my own conduct that emerges as the super ego. And I must realize that I do not get to own my mother's own womb. In fact, I need to find some other way to progress in the symbolic order, um, away from that maneuvers myself out of the Oedipal drama of wanting to get back into the womb of my mother. Like to not put it even in the libidinal qualities of wanting to quote have sex with one's mother or something like that, right? But really like the real libidinal quality and what Freud is after in calling this a stage is that one must redirect, if we're talking about a young male child, like if we're talking at the level of the species and the the production of the species sexually into another generation of something, then we have something there has to be like a displacement and a reorientation towards some other notion of desire outside of the mother. Right. But that doesn't mean that we don't like weirdly in our relationships like end up like, the phenomenon of somebody who's like dating somebody like their mother or their father or something like that, right? Might. So those qualities, what Butler's getting at that is it's maybe not just one way or the other, right? It's not just a rejection. It's not just desiring something for gratification either. Our desires are constituted by our psychic dramas. Later on in the paragraph, it is important to reconsider that identification, sorry, it is important to consider that identification and desire can coexist and that their formulation in terms of mutually exclusive opposition serves a heterosexual matrix. But I would like to focus attention on yet a different construal of that scenario, namely that wanting to be and wanting to have can operate to differentiate mutually exclusive positionalities internal to lesbian erotic exchange. Consider that identifications are always made in response to a loss of some kind, um, and that they involve a certain mimetic practice that seeks to incorporate the lost love within this very identity of the one who remains. This was Freud's thesis in Mourning and Melancholia in 1917. But then Butler says more recent theorists like uh, uh, Mikhail Bork-Jakobson and Bruce Leys, however, identification, in particular identificatory mimeticism, precedes identity. Identity doesn't make the um, desire. The desire is emergent. It exists in the pre-formulated I, in this reading. And so if it precedes identity and constitutes identity, then that which it is fundamentally other to itself. The notion of this other with a capital O in the self, as it were, implies that the self-other distinction is not primarily external, a powerful critique of ego psychology and Freudianism, right? There emerges the self. The self is from the start radically implicated in the capital O other. Um, in Lacan's terms or Lacanian terminology, that might be in the realm of the real too. But Butler goes on to say that Butler still finds that Freud useful later on in that paragraph, but also wants to rethink this quality of psychic mimesis, and so says over and against the account of psychic mimesis by way of incorporation and melancholy, the theory of primary mimeticism argues an even stronger position in favor of the non-self identity of the psychic subject. Mimetism um, uh, is not motivated by a drama of loss and wishful recovery, like the mother Oedipal complex, but appears to proceed and constitute desire and motivation itself. In this way, mimetism would be prior to the possibility of loss and the disappointments of love. And again, if it's not about loss, if it's not about trying to recover something else, maybe it's not about something that's being flawed. to begin with, right? Maybe it's something different. We need to rethink this. Um, Whether loss or mimetism is primary, perhaps is an undecidable problem. The psychic subject is nevertheless constituted internally by differentially gendered others and is therefore never as a gender self-identical. You're not one thing. And then says directly, in my view, the self only becomes a self on the condition that it has suffered a separation. Um, uh, Grammar fails us here, for the it only becomes differentiated through that separation. Um, but that it has suffered a separation, a loss which is suspended and provisionally resolved through the melancholic incorporation of some other. That other installed in the self thus establishes the permanent incapacity of the self to achieve self-identity. It is, as it were, always already disrupted by the other. The disruption of the other at the heart of the self is the very condition of that self's possibility. In Lacan's terms, from the mirror stage kind of stuff, what Lacan says is that we are perpetually living lives of unfulfilled desire. Like, what we don't want is to have all of our desires fulfilled, because it is the ambiguity within our psychic makeup that motivates us to keep going towards things that we desire. So the person who gets married or has a kid or gets a house or gets all of the things that they quote desire in life very, very quickly, falls into a sort of state of of boredom, of ennui, of not knowing what else to do. I don't, and it becomes depressed, right? We need to have an unfulfilled capital D desire in Lacan's terms, and that's exactly, I think, what Butler is saying here with the term of the capital O other, being in the way that that is being used in this essay. Butler goes on, such a consideration of psychic identification would vitiate the possibility of any stable set of typologies that explain or describe something like gay or lesbian identities. Next paragraph down. How does this consideration of psychic identification return us to the question of what constitutes a subversive repetition? How are troublesome identifications apparent in cultural practices? Well, consider the way in which heterosexuality naturalizes itself as through setting up certain illusions of continuity between sex, gender, and desire. When Aretha Franklin sings, "You make me feel like a natural woman," she seems at first to suggest that some natural potential of her biological sex is actualized by her participation in the cultural position of woman as object of heterosexual recognition. Something in her sex is thus expressed by her gender, which is then fully known and consecrated within the heterosexual scene. There is no breakage or no discontinuity between sex biological fact as biological facticity and essence, or between gender and sexuality. Although Aretha appears to be all too glad to have her naturalness confirmed, she also seems fully and paradoxically mindful that the confirmation is never guaranteed, and that the effect of naturalness is only achieved as a consequence of that moment of heterosexual recognition. After all, Aretha sings, "You make me feel like a natural woman," suggesting that this kind of metaphorical substitution, an act of imposture, a kind of sublime or momentary participation in ontological illusion produced by the mundane operations of heterosexual drag. But what if Aretha were singing to me? Or what if she were singing to a drag queen whose performance somehow confirmed her own? If gender is drag, skipping down a few sentences, if gender is drag and if it is imitation that regularly produces the ideal it attempts to approximate, then gender is a performance that produces the illusion of an intersex or essence, or a psychic gender core. It produces on the skin, through the gesture, the move, the gait, the array of corporeal theatrics understood as gender presentation, the illusion of an inner depth. And in effect, one way that gender gets naturalized is through being constructed as an inner psychic or physical necessity. and yet it is always a surface sign, a signification, and with the public body that produces this illusion of an inner depth, necessity, or essence that is somehow magically or causally causally expressed. So to dispute the psyche as inner death, however, is not to refuse the psyche altogether. Um, on the contrary, the psyche calls to be rethought precisely as a compulsive repetition, as that which conditions and disables the repetitive performance of identity. Skipping down a few sentences, the unconscious then is the excess that enables the and contests every performance, which never fully appears within the performance itself. The psyche is not in the body, but in the very signifying process through which that body comes to appear. It is the lapse in repetition as well as the compulsion, precisely what the performance seeks to deny and that which compels it from the start. To locate the psyche within this signifying chain as the instability of all iterability is not the same as claiming that it is its inner core, that it is inner core that is awaiting and fully liberatory expression. On the contrary, the psyche is the permanent failure of expression, a failure that has its values for it impels repetition and so reinstates the possibility of disruption. Then, what does it mean then to pursue disruptive or repetition within compulsory heterosexuality? Although compulsory heterosexuality often presumes that there is a first sex that is expressed through a gender and then through sexuality, it may now be necessary to fully invert and displace that operation of thought. This is something that I think the category of trans comes to do in the 21st century, not in the sense of transitioning against, but in the sense of trans as being above or closer to the way that somebody who identifies as non-binary might be using that as a disruption of the kind of linear sequence. And in some sense, like, I think it like we might even question like the way that we use the term cisgender, um, that cisgender does seem to affirm this kind of linear logic sequence of a sex assigned at birth, producing a gender with a particular kind of sexuality and a sexual orientation, as if it were that way. And I think that we maybe need to be careful of the construction of cisgender itself. Yes, I think it's a better term than straight because it doesn't express a kind of normativity of that particular sexual formation or sexual orientation or sexuality, broadly speaking. But nevertheless, it is a necessary political term, right? That we might want to maintain, even those of us who identify as cisgender, we might want to maintain in a Butlerian sense, a kind of looseness around the sequential aspects of that. Butler goes on here. If a regime of sexuality mandates a compulsory performance of sex, then it may only through that performance that be through that performance that the binary system of gender and the binary system of sex come to have intelligibility at all. It may be that the very categories of sex, of sexual identity, of gender are produced or maintained in the effects of the compulsory performance, effects which are disingenuously renamed as causes, origins, disingenuously lined up within a causal expressive sequence that the heterosexual norm produces to legitimate itself as sexual origin of all sex. How then to expose the causal lines of retrospectively and performatively produced fabrications and to engage gender itself as an inevitable fabrication, to fabricate gender in terms which reveal every claim to the origin, the inner, the true, and the real as nothing other than the effects of drag, whose subversive possibilities ought to be played and replayed to make the quote sex of gender into the site of insistent political play, Perhaps this will be a matter of working sexuality against identity, against gender, even against gender, and of letting that which cannot fully appear in any performance persist in its disruptive promise. Now, one way I have my own sort of ways of thinking about this sort of stuff. If we were to think about the ways the regulatory regime of something like neoliberalism, as we've discussed with Wendy Brown in this course, there is a way that I believe that neoliberalism and the surveillance culture that has arisen within neoliberalism, that kind of policing of gender identity, even if it seems to be coming from the so-called left, the policing of that um, is part of neoliberal capitalism, which tries to make identity categories to produce subjects that can then be marketed to and differentiated from, just like our cookies feeds on our computers do. And that then we come to surveil our own sort of like, well, I am cis. This is I'm going to, as a cisgendered man, that kind of self-police and that kind of governmentality work that Foucault is talking about. I tend to think of this as neoliberalism's attempt to completely dissolve all unconscious and to make all of the unconscious into manifest consciousness that then can then be surveilled and then be disciplined in whatever ways that governmentality or forces of power um, want produce on us and act on us, and that in many ways with like the willing individuals who are, you know, working for free by posting on TikTok and posting on Meta or Facebook or Instagram, whatever, all this time. That kind of subjectivating force it becomes part of the will itself and becomes part of like the confessional structure that would try to alleviate the unconscious altogether. And I think that there's something quite disturbing about that, especially if I take Butler's point seriously here about like that maybe some things like sexuality, we need to preserve the space of ambiguity for that particular. It's what makes sex fun. It's like the ambiguity, right? I'm going to stop there for the day. Thank you for listening and engaging. We are on to Jack Halberstam next. Um, uh, um, and we will pick it up again. Uh, Support us on Patreon if you can, if you're getting stuff out of this. Um, have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whenever, wherever you are.